All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the SDV monthly readout, where our product team shares announcements and updates with you. So each month, we'll plan to go over some recent SDV highlights and give you a sneak peek into what we're currently working on. So my name is Neha Paki, and I am the head of product at Datasibo. Today, I'm going to be walking through our updates for February 2026. So to start with, I want to share two recent highlights from our team. The first highlight is that we recently published a case study from one of our customers, EpiConcept, who is a software provider in healthcare research. So this particular case study was about improving query speeds by a large factor, a factor of 105. And they did this by fine-tuning the database configuration. So this entire process for doing this would not have been possible without SDV Enterprise or synthetic data. The main problem was that EpiConcept couldn't experiment freely with their real production database, which makes sense because like many organizations, their database contained sensitive information about patients and their healthcare outcomes in this case. So they used SDV Enterprise to create a synthetic clone of the database. You can kind of think of that as synthetic patients, synthetic lab results for those patients, and just a whole synthetic universe of that database. So with that database, then the synthetic one, they could bring it down into a lower environment. And then within the lower environment, now they could experiment freely with fine-tuning that database configuration. So then they changed the configuration, measured query speeds, and sort of repeated that process until they were able to hone in on the exact database configuration they needed to make their queries run faster. So as a result, a query that used to take over a minute to run is now taking less than a second. So that's the 105 times improvement we're referencing. SDV Enterprise was a very key part of the solution here, because our software was able to model and create the synthetic database in about an hour. So the database schema here is an anonymized version of EpiConcept's database schema, and it gives you an idea of the complexity. So the schema contains 37 tables with 40 relationships and chains of up to 6 tables, so we call that a depth of 6. So our SDV Enterprise algorithm, which is the HSA synthesizer, took about 55 minutes to train on this data and learn patterns from it, and then only 10 minutes to then create the synthetic database on demand. For this particular use case, it was really important that the synthetic data was realistic. So team wanted to run queries across all 37 of those synthetic tables, and the queries required complex processing. So in order to produce realistic performance estimates for those queries, the synthetic data needed to be realistic as well. So we have a table here at the right that kind of lists all the properties we're talking about when we say the synthetic data should be realistic, and also why that's relevant for the queries. So these top 2 rows here, for example, the queries were joining and aggregating across the tables. So that meant that the synthetic data needed to have referential integrity and the right cardinality, which is the number of connections between the tables. Then the queries were filtering out null values and selecting other specific values, which meant that the synthetic data also needed to have null values and also needed to have the right proportion of other values. And the whole process, of course, needed to be performant. So at the end of the day, we're happy to report that SDV Enterprise was able to meet all of these needs and lead to a successful use case. So here are some takeaways if you're interested in doing a similar project to fine-tune your database configuration. So first, create that synthetic database and put it in a lower environment. And of course, SDV Enterprise is great at doing this for complex interconnected schemas. Second, you can now experiment with fine-tuning the database configuration in that lower environment. It's a safe place to experiment with data that's synthetic. And then finally, once you hone in on that right database configuration, you can then go back to your original production database and update it with that configuration. So as a result, your queries on the production database should now be faster. So we hope that going through this case study was useful. Many users tell us that they love case studies because it showcases what's possible with synthetic data. And we're always eager to learn about new use cases and learn about the new ways you're using synthetic data. Now I want to shift attention a little bit into SDB Enterprise and some of the product features. So let's go into the second highlight from the product team. So the second highlight is that we have enhanced one of our synthesizers, the SegmentSynthesizer. So the synthesizer is available in our X-Synthesizers bundle, which is an add-on to SDB Enterprise. So the synthesizer is meant for highly segmented data, just like its name. And segmented data typically contains different types of patterns for every segment. So an example here is if you have a data set of transactions, regular transactions will have different statistical patterns and properties than the fraudulent transactions. So the segment synthesizer is particularly optimized to be able to find and learn different patterns in these segments. The result of this is that the synthetic data it creates is very realistic. So with our updates to the synthesizer, you actually now have a choice in how those segments are determined. So you can allow SegmentSynthesizer to algorithmically find those segments. In this case, it would algorithmically find, this group of data points is a different segment than maybe this group of data points. Or you can now tell the SegmentSynthesizer explicitly to, if you know your segments already, you can input that. So I want to go through a couple examples of this just to see how you can use it. So one of them is if you want to use your data for training a machine learning model and you want to supplement it with synthetic data. So in this example, you might be building a machine learning algorithm that detects regular versus fraudulent transactions. So in this case, you already have a column, is fraud, that is exactly the segments that you want to consider. Because fraudulent transactions, again, have different properties than the regular ones. So here you're telling the segment synthesizer to factor that in specifically when learning the different types of patterns in your data. Another application is data that already contains different types of records. So if you have survey responses, for example, about different types of products. In this case, the product code column is probably the one you want to use as segments because you know that each product's responses are going to have distinct patterns. So you can generally use the segment synthesizer when you want to create very realistic data for these different segments. So now let's take a sneak peek into some of the features that are currently on our roadmap. These are the things that our team is actively working on. The first item here has to do with our constraints feature. So in SDV, constraints are a way to input business logic to the synthesizer and enforce that 100% of synthetic data that it creates will always follow that rule. So there's no exceptions here. So business rules typically are logic that can't be expressed just in a normal relational database. So the example I have here is that your database might have tables with accounts and perks. And your database might have a record that every account can be associated with 0 or more perks. That's just a primary foreign key relationship. But there's another business rule that can be layered on top of that. And that is only premium type accounts are allowed to be connected to any perks at all. So up until now, you had to identify these patterns from our list of predefined patterns. We have some in our SDV community, and we have others in our CAG bundle, which is an add-on to SDV Enterprise. So once you identified the patterns, you then had to add them to your synthesizer. So now the team is working on a way to automatically detect the most common business rules that we see in enterprise databases. So this example here is just one of many that we've come across. So by default, the goal is that your synthetic data will be just more realistic because it will contain all those business rules that we've found. The second and final item I have here is the ability to easily model schemas with composite keys. So just as a refresher, a composite key is when a set of columns together acts as a primary or foreign key reference. So in this table, for example, the combination of patient ID and date together is the primary key. So an individual patient ID is allowed to repeat because a patient can come back multiple times. And a date is also allowed to repeat because many patients can come on the same date. But when you combine a patient ID and a date, that has to be unique. That's the primary key. So our team is currently working on a way to allow you to add composite keys to our SDB metadata. The ultimate goal here is to have a seamless integration where that composite key information can be transferred from your database to SDB metadata and then to your synthesizer. Again, all with this goal of creating synthetic data with the right connections. So with that, I want to thank you all for tuning into our monthly update, and we hope to see you again in March.